It's time for our first panel discussion session of the conference. This will be covering how the Department of Education, Sport and Culture will look to improve childcare and education provision for the long term. I'm going to invite our panellists, who I can see over there, to make their way to the stage, if they would please, to start making their way to the stage. And as they make their way, I just want to pass on a message I've been passed on from the Minister, Julie Edge. She does send her sincere apologies for not being present this evening. She's recovering from some pretty major surgery. She didn't mind saying 10 or 11 days or so ago now, and whilst she hoped to be back, regrettably can't be, but she says it won't keep her out of action for long, and she has some very good education professionals who inspire every day our future leaders. And a thank you also to Mr. Craine for stepping in at short notice. A message from the Minister. I also want to say it's probably an ideal time to mention Slido. There is a code, hashtag IOMGov23, as you can see there. You can also go on slido.com and enter the hashtag, submit your question. If indeed you prefer to ask a question that way, you may ask in person, because there will also be staff going around with roaming mics shortly, once we get this panel discussion underway. But just before we do, the Treasury Minister, Alex Allinson, Jesamine Kelly, the Principal at UCM, Max Kelly, the Executive Head at Doon, Laxey and Williston School, Graeme Corrin, the Head at Ballacameen, and also Gary Pearce, the Director of Hopes and Dreams Nursery, and of course Mr. Craine. Thank you very much for joining us. And as is typical, you leave me the furthest walk. At least I'll get my steps in this way, I suppose. I'll just grab a microphone. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all of you for joining us this evening. I will start with the gentleman next to me, if I may, because just before we open this up, want to ask you how you think our education system integrates, if you like, our unique cultural heritage, our unique values into the curriculum, because it has to do that whilst also preparing young people for a globalised world, if you like.
That's absolutely right, of course, yes, and it has ever been such. You know, as a geography teacher, teaching at Castle Rushen for many years, that's one of the balances we were trying to make. You mentioned in there unique heritage, and you mentioned unique values. I think I'd like to start with the values bit, because if we try to say what are the values of the Isle of Man, I guess we would pick out things such as good community, collaboration, boxing above our weight, maybe, things like that. Some various sort of values that we'd say, yeah, these are part of this place. These are not separate from what students are going to need to be successful in the globalization of the future. You know, the values that we're developing, which are often more caught than taught in a school context, but these are the values that'll stand them well in the future. The bit that's harder to fit into this is where you cover heritage and culture within the curriculum, especially when students move into years 10, 11, 12, 13, and they're following GCSE and A-level courses, which don't include anything that relates to the Isle of Man. But there are always opportunities to build things in terms of local field work or educational visits or things like that. And it's absolutely essential that that is done. We cannot leave our young people without an understanding of the heritage, the politics, the history, the sense of place of the Isle of Man, because that it is essential to know where you're coming from and who you are to be able to achieve in the wider world. So I see those two things as being part of the same coin.
As linked, thank you. Really, this is for our three heads, if you like, Jesamine, Max and Graeme. Ladies first, I suppose, no pressure. If I ask, really, how do you think the collaborative efforts between government, between educational institutions, between community stakeholders, how are they enhancing, for want of a better word, the overall quality of education and childcare in the island. And it's interesting, we've got you at 3 different levels of the education sphere here, but I'll start with you, Jesamine, if I may.
Okay, so I'm sure that my fellow head teachers would agree. We have a really strong and close working relationship to ensure effective transition for our students from level to level. I think that's working better and better. Of course, we work closely with the Department for Education. In my context, I work closely with a range of government agencies, the third sector, employers, to make sure that what our offer is of high quality. We listen to our awarding bodies, we go out and see good practice in other colleges, and we focus on excellent staff development, so working with high quality deliverers to make sure that we are delivering a high quality education, and working with our partners, for example, in Jersey and Guernsey as a college, to review what we're doing and share best practice. And I think in terms of what we will do with DESK, reviewing our policies, working closely with different stakeholders to really focus on what is a high quality education. I mean, I've passed to Max now, but I think there's a lot of close working relationships happening in lots of different ways, including how we deliver our courses and ensure that our education is inclusive as well.
So what at primary level, Max, if I may ask? Thanks.
Well, I'll start by saying I think technology feeds very much into this space, and certainly in the post-COVID world, where we've all become much more expert in using things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and that's really important to mention, because we sit here today with a background of things like independent reports from Beamans, which talked about fractured relationships between schools and DESK. And here we are today, several years on, and that's no longer the case. And I want to emphasise that part of that is a much closer working relationship with the central department between the schools, and things like Teams and technology have certainly enabled that. Very regular meetings between what I would call the central department and the schools and head teachers, and I think that's a real strength to the system. It should be reassuring to parents and stakeholders in schools that there's a real synergy now between what goes on in St John's and what goes on in the ground in schools. So there's technology. The other thing that came to mind with these questions about collaboration of schools and how we can make sure that we keep the cultural heritage alive alongside some of the modern practices and some of the things that we face in this century. Every morning I get out of the car and I'm met at Doon School with just the most gorgeous backdrop of North Barrule. And it would be just madness if we didn't play to our strengths and tap into that and integrate the rich cultural heritage of the Isle of Man into every aspect of what we do in schools, to make learning and to make education relevant and give it a context for our children and young people. So designing a curriculum around, with a strong focus on the Roman Empire, when I have a school in Macclesfield that has Manse Crosses and the wonderful monument of Cashel and Ard, it would be madness to do that. So you have to play to your strengths. You have to make sure that you link everything into the context around you, and that involves bringing people in, visitors in, Macclesfield Social Club, the local church, Girl Guides Association own the woods opposite. It's important that you have those relationships with all those different stakeholders as well.
How do you do that at Ballacameen, Graeme, Corrin?
Yeah, I would echo everything that's been said by my colleagues there. I think I'd go back to this afternoon, actually, in this very hall, to see all our sixth form students and college students in one place at one time. It just kind of made it really clear some of the words that we're talking about, having common values and having a shared aim. That absolutely is clear, because clearly everybody on this Isle of Man has to be invested in our youngsters. That's something that is shared now across our organisation, across education. Personally, I think that we are in a position now where we have kind of reset the relationships, re-established the values. We've made sure that they are shared across all of our organisations. I think probably we are at a launch pad, if you like. It's quite an exciting moment for us to be involved in education, because I think our capacity to continue to develop in all of these areas is really important. We talked about, Paul talked about in the Minister's speech, the task finish groups, for example. So we have developments that have come out of these collaborations and these relationships that have created something that will take us forward into the future. And probably finally, I would say, we're talking about values, integrity being one of the most important ones. We can use those relationships, I think, to be honest with each other and to challenge each other. And that's what this conference also seems to be about. Let's be open and honest, because also sitting, looking at the young people in a hall, you realise this is their one chance at education, so we've got to get it right, and we've got to move at some pace as well.
Well, in terms of preparing students for the wider world, if you like, in what ways, Jesamine, do you at UCM prioritise well-being and mental health of students and educators, really?
Okay, so as a further education college, UCM really focuses on understanding the different journeys the students have taken to get there, and making sure that our approach is really inclusive, that the right courses are available for the students who need them, so that they can make the right choices, they're supported on their journey, that we make sure that all those learners are having those work-based encounters that make them more employable, more confident, more resilient, more adaptive, more able to change jobs and change careers if they need to. And also introducing different ways of being more inclusive and widening access to education. For example, last year we worked with Desk to make English and Maths free for over 16-year-olds up to level 2. So this year, a large number of students have acquired GCSE level grade C or above. So those sort of strategies to improve inclusion, to raise attainment, to be inclusive are really important. Again, this year we've got a strong student services team, a learning support team that really focus on individual needs. But again, this year we see a bigger focus on building mental wealth, so developing approaches that really improve mental wealth in our students, and working closely with our stakeholders, such as Manx Care. So, for example, we have students with us from the Recovery College on our site, and many of those students are now progressing onto courses at the college. So, again, making that journey. Those things I think are really key, and continuing to develop all those systems and monitoring, so that when we know we've got students with adverse experiences, that we're really focused on supporting and monitoring their success and their outcomes too. And working closely with the schools on transition is absolutely critical for the students coming to us at 14 to 16 and 16 to 18. And also working with other providers around helping students stay and achieve. So whether that's employers, the third sector, our apprentices, our higher education students, really focusing on continuing to develop and supporting our staff with excellent CPD, so that they continue to be delivering a really good approach to our students too.
And in terms of, I mean, we hear a lot of stakeholders, multi-agency approaches, all the buzz phrases, but of course, a lot of people respectfully just want to know how their little Johnny or little Sarah or whoever's going to get on as they come through, right from hopes and dreams age right through to sixth form and beyond. So what, perhaps, Graeme, this one's for you, perhaps what examples have you got of innovative educational programs or practices that are successful in promotive active learning, creativity, critical thinking? Secondary, I'm thinking of more than anyone. What examples can you give us?
Yeah, I think kind of Paul's touched on this already a little bit. I think the essence of good teaching and good learning has always been around and about these things. So we are far more evidence informed now. CPD is based around what works and what has been proven to work across different jurisdictions, and we're able to have a look at that and make a decision based on what we think is going to fit our context best. So the thing that has changed for me significantly is the fact that whereas in the past we might well have had a strategy and then another strategy and another one, now we are beginning to focus on and maintain a single thread and a single focus on teaching and learning, and making sure that that is our priority. We talked about well-being, and you can't take well-being and learning away from each other. You know, students will not learn if they are not in a safe and secure environment. So for me, the innovative practice is around well-being. It's about how do we maintain the highest standards of all students, and whilst still being compassionate and caring and all of those those human qualities that we've spoken about this afternoon.
Max, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think from my thoughts on this are, if you want children to be successful, they need to be engaged with their learning, and that all starts with the wonderful work that we do in our schools in the Isle of Man. If you want passionate readers, it's not rocket science. You need to put passionate people in front of them, working with them, teaching them. If you want children to be able to pick up the paintbrush and create wonderful pieces of art, you need them to have passionate people there to bring lessons to life. And on the Isle of Man, we're afforded this fantastic opportunity as school leaders and as school communities to develop curriculums, to develop programs of study, to develop pieces of work and lessons that really play into the engagement of our students in that way. Teachers have got an opportunity to step in. So if you're talking about innovative practice, conversations around what do we teach, why do we teach it, when do we teach it, you need to have the interest of the teachers in that space. And again, I think I mentioned before this idea of technology. I think schools have got a real job here to make sure that we are at the forefront of emerging technologies. I know that the Chief Officer of Desk talked at the Youth Impact Summit a little bit about AI this morning, and I think AI, one of these emerging technologies, is something that we can really step into and use in schools. It doesn't mean we're the experts in it, but we certainly shouldn't shy away from it. And that powerful coming together of technology, passion and interest, that's what helps to keep children interested and engaged, and that's what gives education a real life and a real zing and a real buzz. One of the members of the Education Council on the Isle of Man was talking to me recently and said to me, here's a word, Max, for you. It's Imagineering. And it's a word that's made up of imagination and engineering. And it's a word that's owned by Disney PLC. And she says that this is a word that is used by Disney. It's for their employees. The people who work for Disney have to make something, build something. That's the engineering part. But imagination, that allows a creative space. And that really got me thinking. So one of the pieces of work that I'm doing in the primary schools where I work at the moment is taking that concept of Imagineering. Now that's a Disney word, so we can't go there. So we've come up with our own word, which is education and innovation and eduvation. We're not just teachers in the primary schools on the Isle of Man. We are eduvators, and we're really allowed to do that with all of the freedoms that we're afforded by the department.
I'm aware we'll have about just over half an hour, and I do want to open up. The questions are coming in thick and fast now on Slido side. I do want to open it up, and I want to talk to Gary Pearce and the Minister briefly before we do so, but not so fast, actually. I just wanted to ask you, we heard before about the approach of having a head teacher in charge of more than one school has been implemented. Why is it, I mean, it's got pros and cons, I would imagine. You can only be in one place at one time.
Well, I'm a football supporter, football fan, support Tottenham. It probably tells you everything you need to know about me. And the friends that I keep and the people I meet and socialise with, they're football fans too. So on a night out, or if we're meeting up for a coffee, inevitably, conversation at some point will turn to football, especially after an FC Isle of Man game, or perhaps the England national team have played. And haven't we all got an opinion about which player should have been picked and what decisions the manager's made? And we feel qualified to have those opinions and to have those conversations because three things, I think. We played football as kids, so we've played the game, we've experienced it. We see football and hear about football on the TV, on Sky Sports News, in the newspaper, on podcasts. So there's a narrative around it that we buy into. And you know, I've supported Tottenham now for too long, 40-ish years, I guess. So I'm invested in them. I have an investment in them. It matters to me. And I think that's an analogy of education. Everyone in this room, I guess the vast majority certainly, went to school. It's an important subject. It's always talked about. It's the focus of our conference here this evening. And it matters. We've got children, we're parents, so we're invested in it. So we have opinions, but they're not necessarily informed opinions. If you put me in charge of FC Isle of Man or Tottenham Hotspur, it would be an unqualified disaster. I'd be using the 4-4-2 formation, and that went out years ago. The world has moved on, and the world has moved on here in education as well. Ed teachers of more than one school and the executive ed teacher role is actually not something new. It's something that lots of places all over the world, and I have colleagues who I've been liaising with in Norway, in Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, China even, who have gone down this model for a long time. And if you speak to people in the private sector or perhaps people who work in places outside of education, they will tell you the separation of strategic and operational is something that was done long, long ago. So I applaud places like the Isle of Man that are looking at this and saying this is a modern way of working and this is a reason why we should do it. And actually, James, if you look at some of the, so it's not new on the Isle of Man either. I mean, I've been doing this role now for
3-4 years, is it?
Yeah, longer than that. I think Doon and Latsy have been collaborating now for more like 7 years, and successfully so. And that's borne out with the data that is freely available on websites. That's borne out by what parents tell me. It's borne out what our previous Q&A quality assurance programme showed us. So it's not something that we should be scared of. And just one final thought on this. Ed teachers of single schools is a model that came from a very long time ago, Victorian time, when you had the headmaster or the headmistress at a school. It's not necessarily a fit-for-purpose model for the modern world. And if you want head teachers or a head of school or somebody in a role who is focused on the stuff that matters, you said before, it matters about my little Johnny and my little Sarah, then you need to free up people and create roles that give the space for that. And head teachers, you can see across the world, especially if you look across the water, some of the recruitment issues, getting heads in who have to do that important stuff with children, but are also dealing with finance, with budgeting, with HR, with staffing matters, with complaints, with policies. There's only so much headspace that exists in the modern world. So this is a different way of doing it that I think DEST have looked at. How can we make sure that we are going to recruit people into these posts? How are we going to retain people in these posts? We've talked about mental health and well-being. That's for our staff team too. So there's lots of advantages here, and I think the Isle of Man isn't catching up with it because we're doing it in a slightly different way, but we've had a look at how other people have done it. We've come up with a model that works for the Isle of Man, and it's in place, and I can only see success with this.
Well, however Spurs get on this season, I think education's a political football, and I want to continue on the theme of well-being, actually. Thank you for that, Matt. Gary Pearce, because obviously childcare from the outset is crucial for working parents and guardians as well. But how do you, from your perspective, how can the government collaborate with the private sector to expand that affordable and high quality childcare options, really, addressing the needs of families, but also supporting that childcare workforce's well-being and professional development? I can repeat the question.
Quite a lot in there. So governments are collaborating, but they really need to. I've been in the
Are they doing enough, though?
No, there's always room for more, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I think, let me explain, I've been in childcare for 25 years. Never has it had the focus that it's had since COVID and since the global shortage of talent has driven countries to compete to attract people with childcare as one of their tools. So government have put a lot of effort into this already. The childcare strategy is a great document. Working through the practicalities of delivering that strategy is fraught with difficulties. This panel's predominantly desk, but it's across government. So it's DHSS, we've got regulatory reviews, the legal sort of background is completely being rewritten at this moment. We've got, like most sectors, workforce issues, and parents, from their point of view, are having all sorts of affordability issues around the cost of living issues. So for once, I don't believe that the minister sat next to me with the purse strings is the solution. He's part of the solution, and government need to understand the complex nature of delivering a varied quality offering to parents and, most importantly, to the children. Now, we are blessed to have a very high quality childcare sector that is very varied. Day nurseries, childminders, preschools. It's a wide gamut, but expansion is also something that has been called for by people who have responded to surveys. Under twos care is something that people have asked for. That's not, in my opinion, for the child. That's for the economic benefits for working parents. So that's a DFE issue as well. Some of the historical positions we've had, and for a long time childcare has been ignored from the educational point of view. That has changed now. There are people that understand the depth of quality that is required and what needs to happen for that to be delivered. But we are lagging behind in terms of development of the workforce. The amount of training that's available historically has not been significant. And we've got also special educational needs and equality issues that need to be tackled. So there's an awful lot going on, and it's a very complex challenge for government.
Just a couple of examples of what issues you believe need to be addressed, prioritised.
Attracting and retaining workforce. That's our biggest problem with capacity at the moment, and therefore availability for parents, and to make sure that every child has got access to quality childcare. There's probably a 2-year lead-in time to that, to be fair. And then retaining people, unfortunately, the nature of it is these people, when they're trained, are actually quite attractive to schools. So typically the sector will lose people to schools every year. So we're at the bottom of the food chain almost, and we need to keep feeding people in, but then giving them a real career, a career path. I mean, the work is fantastic, the job satisfaction people get. We've always relied on that as a society. It's taken the goodwill of people working with young children and not paying them what other sectors may be able to pay to make it work. 2 increases in minimum wages have had a massive effect on the cost of delivery. So if we're looking at affordability, how do we do that and also look after our staff to make it attractive and cover that for parents?
Which leads us in nicely, it's almost like we planned this, to the man with the purse strings, Alex Allinson. Thank you for waiting patiently. We're looking at long-term improvements in education. So from your perspective, with your Treasury hat on, what are the key budgetary constraints?
First of all, thanks very much for the panellists for taking time out to be here, because it is quite humbling to be with educationalists. But from a strict point of view in terms of government, I think there's that realisation of the value of childcare and education, and that you can't do it on the cheap. It's as simple as that. And if you do try to cut corners, you actually affect the quality of that. And in terms of the childcare strategy, which is a good document, I think it's absolutely imperative that government deliver on that. And the key 2 pillars of that was put the child first, and that's about education as well as care, but also give every parent or carer a choice in what they want to do. So the key issues are accessibility of childcare and also affordability. And that's where government can step in. But to lead on from what Gary was saying, One of the things we're trying not to do is bold statements that we can't deliver on. And that's why it's incredibly important when we're talking about strategies, we work with the people who are delivering it, whether that's in terms of the private sector and the preschool sector, whether that's primary schools, secondary schools, tertiary education, or long-term learning as well. Because not everyone goes to sixth form, not everyone goes to UCM. A lot of people will go into straight into employment, but at a later date want to actually have their qualifications. And earlier on, when we had this entire hall full of young people, Graeme Kinraid was very much emphasising to them that qualifications give you choice throughout your life, and so that lifelong learning is really important. So my job is to try to make sure that we put the money where it's necessary, when it's necessary, that we don't push things along and make it the people there unable to provide those, but we provide the people with the right resources in terms of either whether it's workforce, whether it's the financial resources or the technological resources to then take things forward.
We could talk about childcare and the childcare strategy on its own and have a complete session on that, but we're talking about the devil in the detail and achieving what we're striving to achieve and the improvements that each and every one of you have spoken about in your own way. How can we do that when the department is still in a position, and you're part of government, and I'll put this to Mr. Craine in a moment as well, when the relationship with the department is seemingly still a little bit like that, and when, across the board in one particular union, we're still in action one platform short of strike. I mean,
yeah. I think both Max and Graeme have already talked about the collaborative efforts that are going on between central government, the department, and individual schools.
They've been going on for 4 years, yeah. but we're still in this position.
But also with collaboration, with working together, you get a deeper understanding of where people are, and that leads to far better co-working, whether that's having a teacher in charge of a couple of different schools, or the networking that's been done so that people understand if there are problems with budgets, where they're coming from, if there are problems with resources, where they're coming from, if there are opportunities, they are shared with everyone. You can't, Max mentioned the Beeman's report, which talked about a fractured relationship. It takes time to develop that honestly and with integrity, rather than paper over it and pretend everything's all right. And that's a constant bit of work that will need to be done right across the childcare sector, right across the education sector, which will constantly have to be worked at. And we will disagree. And quite rightly, we will disagree. But as long as we can be open and honest about that and work together, I think we'll get through it, and we will improve education and childcare on the island.
Has the relationship improved, Graeme, Corrin?
Yep, definitely. But like I said before, it has to be an enabling relationship, not a cozy relationship that we fool each other that everything's going okay. We have to be open, we have to be honest, and we need to say these are the things that aren't right in our schools or in our education system, in our childcare system at the moment. And yeah, it's our professional responsibility to create those as priorities. And it does come down to resourcing. Sometimes our allocation of current resource, and unfortunately the pie sometimes does need to be a little bit bigger as well. I understand that every department will be looking for a bigger share of the pie.
Wanting their own slice of the pie. Yeah. Well, Paul Craine, I appreciate you've not been a member of the upper house for when this went back, 2020, just before COVID, actually, the first lockdown. I think the story goes that the department was literally that close to getting an agreement with the teachers. For whatever reasons, that hasn't happened 3.5 years. Are we any closer?
I'm afraid I'm not in a position to answer that.
No.
Remember, I've been in Legislative Council 2 years, but I've only been in the department since May, so my involvement in that side has been quite limited. But I'm really heartened by the comments that are being made here by head teachers, and that clearly makes it look as if it's moving forward, and I think there is a general feeling that, we're moving forward on this.
Are we any closer?
I think that there is that respect, that understanding. I think there's also that understanding, not just in education, but it goes to healthcare as well, that what we're talking about here isn't just about money. It's also about workforce. It's also about workload. And in terms of recruitment and retention, to allow enthusiastic staff to teach well, they have to have the time and the energy to do that. And if you're working people too hard and you don't look at their workload and you constantly pile things on them, then they get burnt out. And we've seen, you know, good teachers, good doctors, good nurses burnt out and leaving the island. So I think it is that full package which can only be developed by cooperation, by understanding and negotiation. And I think there's been an awful lot of negotiation that's gone on. And that will always continue.
I've been informed that we haven't got roaming mics for this session. However, I'm more than happy for anybody who wants to, hasn't submitted a question via Slido and wishes to ask a question to do so, because I think it's only fair. So I can see at least one gentleman at the back there, maybe two. So I will come to both of you shortly. I just want to take a few off Slido, first of all, if I may. This one's for the Treasury Minister. Is funding available for Castle Rushen High School, and how much is estimated? I think you could have predicted that one.
Yes, so the funding is available for Castle Rushen High School for the new school development there. We've looked at other plans in that area because obviously there's been talk about the swimming pool there as well. We've changed the capital programme, so the Pink Book used to be a once in a year attempt to get something on the capital programme. We're now doing it quarterly. So I'm going to announce in Tynwald fairly shortly that we've put it into the development phase. We've allocated money to get some proper drawings done, to look again at the demographics of the south, how big the school needs to be done, because you've seen massive growth in population there with all the new houses, but also work with the educators, work with the local councils to get the right school. How much is it going to cost? Pre-COVID, it was around about 42 million for a new school. So we're estimating something along those lines, plus, you know, inflationary costs. But to get it right and learn the lessons as well of having that flexibility in terms of an educational establishment that will raise standards, but also be a really great place to work in and to learn. So the money is there for Castle Rushen. Yep.
Super, thank you. If I move on to Jesamine, if I may, another question. What is UCM? And I'm going to ask this gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, if we can keep the answers for the last quarter of an hour or so fairly succinct, just so we can get through as many as possible. What is UCM doing to attract more international students to the island?
Okay, so we are working closely with Enterprise was one example to look at pathways into the island. There are some other. We talk about other agencies, but obviously there's immigration to work through as well. We are introducing courses, working with partners to facilitate progression to master's level studies for our work-based integrated scheme and other models that we're currently using. Working with employers as well to support training of their staff wherever they've come from. So our apprenticeship routes, our training programs. Tomorrow you'll see, if you're here, 200 people being fed by our catering students who are both apprentices or full-time students. In a couple of weeks' time, we'll have a launch of our adult learning strategy, which again is focused on training and education for a range of employers and individuals. And then in our research festival, celebrating the work of our students, including our international students in October. So we're continuing to look at ways to introduce and integrate international students into our offer. We review our fee policies every year, and we do that closely with Desk. So finding different ways to reach those different individuals. And of course, we made English and Maths free with Desk last year, and that included our English as a second language programs too. So those people that come to the island are helped to integrate more easily.
Has the education review, the funding review, Minister, is it being completed? And does it indicate under funding?
Certainly we've got some preliminary results of that. It tries to benchmark the amount spent on our department with other places in the UK. I think it is difficult to benchmark it because the Desk also run here, they run the NSC, they run a whole range of other facilities. We could spend more. And certainly in the past, we've talked about things like pupil premium, and that wasn't seen as necessarily the right way to try to target those resources in those key geographical areas and key educational areas that needed extra resources. But again, in terms of trying to use new technologies, in terms of some of the collaborative work that goes on in between, particularly secondary schools for some of the niche subjects, I think that's a way that we can increase the choice to pupils while still not necessarily having to increase those budgets. We can work a little bit smarter using new technology. Can we spend more on education? Absolutely.
Does it indicate underfunding in areas?
it indicates that certain areas need to be prioritised, absolutely. And what I'd say there is particularly in terms of primary education, particularly in terms of preschool, so that when people get into primary school, we know where their benchmarks, we know that they've got the capacity to learn, and we don't expect teachers to play catch up on various issues that haven't been picked up beforehand. And that's why it's very important to open up increasing access to preschool education so that we can raise the standards throughout before people get into mainstream and primary and secondary.
Thank you. I had a gentleman down here. The gentleman just with your hand up just behind the pillar. If you could make yourself known, sir.
Physical work. What are you doing anything about that in education, or are you just going through the mill and then have to find, go to college?
Well, if I can just talk about that to begin with. So I think, as Max was saying, trying to link people with their natural environment in terms of they live on the Isle of Man. We have a huge, agricultural influence here, and we live on a beautiful island, and farmers are the custodians of the countryside, so that's really important. Going on to secondary level, certainly, Graeme came from Ramsey Grammar, and their rural science unit, and the way they get every pupil involved in terms of looking after the pigs, of understanding not just agriculture, but where food comes from. And those sort of values is incredibly important. And then in terms of UCM's involvement, in terms of giving people career opportunities outside of what would be seen as very scientific aspects, I think is important as well. But one of the key things is opening up to people, particularly young people, the opportunities in farming. So working quite closely with the NFU, I think, is really important.
Dare I say it, the Treasury Minister bringing home the bacon there. I didn't think we'd get that mentioned today. Gentleman at the front, yes. Are you able to come here and just project? Yes, certainly, sir.
Project better with a microphone. Thanks, James. Good afternoon to the panel, or good evening to the panel. I hear a lot of passion coming from the educators there, and from Max, you're saying about the uniqueness of the Isle of Man. Everything was going well until you mentioned Tottenham. But I just want to come back to the sex education bill and what's been taught with the sex education. And I'm looking at the feedback from people who are involved in presenting this, saying that it should have been left as it was, teachers who don't want to teach it, and listening to Charlie Morrie's latest media coverage with Energy from children who don't want to be taught this type of stuff. So my question to you as educators is, how do you feel about what is getting taught to children of that age, specifically transgenderism, which is it's a very minority, but is getting pushed and it's very controversial all over the world at the moment, and we have seemed to have picked up an Irish strategy that's or policy that is flawed from when we brought it here. So I'm asking you as educators and Alex from the government, what's your view on the transgenderism and what's being taught to young people on the island at the moment, and is it really necessary? Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, from a government perspective, my background in terms of medicine, then becoming education minister, and having worked in schools as a schools doctor in central London, I think sex education is incredibly important. But again, it has to be age appropriate. So from a primary school level, you're talking about relationship education, which is all about integrity and respect and understanding. And so, yes, there has to be an understanding why people are different, whether they're from different colours, creeds, religions, all of that, to understand those differences and respect those. Then you get into secondary school, and there you're talking about relationship and sex education. Now, you mentioned sex education bill. We don't legislate for it. But when you look at the UK and their guidance, which was 2019, it was quite obvious that they stressed that the people who should be educating their children about sex and relationship education of the parents. And the roles of schools are to consolidate on that and answer any of the questions and work with parents around that. So the second report in terms of looking at how people are educated on the Isle of Man, particularly secondary school children in terms of sex and relationship education, is really looking at how we can make sure that the teachers who teach it have the skills and the resources to do that. How can we make sure that the parents are aware of what their child is going to be learning when and where the resources are from and what it involves, and also to be absolutely certain that those parents who don't want their children to be taught about sex education have the right and the ability to withdraw their children if they so feel, but they can do that by talking to the head teachers, getting that understanding of what's being taught, what they don't want to be taught, but actually having that conversation, that openness. And I think that's incredibly important as we go forward. But I'd be grateful, because it is a big topic, and I know it's created an awful lot of anxiety. And there's been this idea that it's being done behind closed doors. What we need to do is possibly make sure that people realise that teaching and education has to be open, and everyone has to be involved in it, whether that's at a primary school level, secondary school level, or even tertiary level.
Well, just before I go to the heads, you were the Minister of Education, weren't you, when that curriculum was introduced?
When I came in 2020, we were beginning to review some of the ways that sex and relationship education was taught. And then COVID happened and everyone went online. And so some of that key work to try to make sure it was standardized as well, that it didn't matter which school you went to, the teachers had the same resources, the same time, the same ability to deal with the pupils. But similarly, they could also have the ability to tailor what they were teaching to the individual class. There are some classes where you may want to separate the boys from the girls. There are some classes where you may want to teach in a slightly different way and at a slightly different rate.
So why was it rolled out then before staff and parents were informed?
Right. I think staff and parents were informed. I think but they weren't informed perhaps enough. I think we can always communicate better. I think also there is that need, that running time to get the right resources and the right training into sex and relationship education so that people have the skills to do it. And certainly in the UK, that's something that's been really well developed that we, up until now, have lacked on the Isle of Man. I mean, my own sex education was appalling back in the 70s and 80s. It was left up to my PE teacher because he was the only one left in the staff room when the people were putting up their hands. I would like to think that we've moved on significantly since then, but also, as Max was saying, from a parent's point of view and from an educator's point of view, we are up against social media. It is appalling that our children are learning their sex education online, sometimes by watching pornography. And that's the reality that educators are having to compete against.
Graeme, Corrin, very quickly, if you may.
Yeah, very quickly, I would support what Alex is saying there. RSE, vitally important. We cannot ignore something that is so important. I think a review is healthy. It's our constant cycle within education, and that's quite right as well. Training is essential. That is something that clearly has been identified. We need to train either our staff or we need to establish specialist teams of staff. That is something that would be positive. Communication with most things, that is what will make or break anything. In this sense, over-communication of the entire RSE curriculum, which covers predominantly relationships and again, these human values that we've talked about, how we react and treat other people within our community is important. And the final thing I would say is our education has to reflect our community, and we need to recognise that. Certainly at Ballacombe, one of our key values is respect, and I would see it within that context.
Max Kelly, how much of an issue can it become in the final 2 years, year 5 and 6 of primary schools?
Look, I think lots of the points have been covered here that I would say. What I do know is that I'm sitting here today and I can think of 3 high-profile people, not on the Isle of Man, celebrities in the UK, who are in the news and have been in the news this year for issues to do with sexual misdemeanors, treating people incorrectly, quite often powerful men and their relationship towards women. So I don't know all the answers here. I'm heartened to hear that it's a conversation. I think we need to keep this conversation going. But the fact that there are these high-profile stories out there in the news today tells me that there is something that needs to be done. And absolutely, schools should be stepping into a space to make sure that we are raising our children, bringing our children up, teaching our children to be respectful towards one another.
Gentleman in the red top with your hand up. I don't know if you want to come a little bit closer, sir. Yes, by all means, yeah. You heard that, Treasurer Minister?
Yeah, I mentioned that before. I mean, we did look into pupil premium. There was a funding bid from education just before I came into it in 2020. And at the time, it wasn't seen as the best way on the Isle of Man for prioritising spend, particularly in terms of primary education, to those, some of the inner city schools that really needed it. I think when you look at the Isle of Man, deprivation is fairly well spread out right across the island, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it is. But I think certainly what we need to do is have that ability to put resources in so that we raise the educational attainment that's possible for children by early intervention, and that's what a lot of the work in terms of the childcare strategy looks at. So the argument about whether pupil premium is the best way of doing that, I think is still open, but what we're looking at is trying to raise standards right the way across the board, not just necessarily in primary and secondary schools.
Thank you very much. I think I saw a couple more hands. Yes, sir, Mr. Kenner.
Hi, some very short things, sir. I represent a group, increasingly large group of parents who have issues with education because of the needs of their children. The question is, certainly with the size of the world, it ticks in the box in that. The policy that was put in place in the secondary schools last year. How are you helping children remove the barriers to learning? It seems to be that the policy put in place last year excluded more children because of the rules that were carried forward. And also, as part of that, how do they learn? Because they didn't have to stay here. Because those children from last year have now left education, gone to college, and then taken seats as well. So they have no place in this development. So how are you removing the obstacles?
I don't think everybody heard that. I think Graeme, no. What I'm going to do, if I may, I've just had a word with Mr. Craine. He struggled to hear some of that, but as soon as this session finishes, he's going to come down and chat to you and hopefully talk. Do you want to come a bit closer? I do apologise. Hopefully this will be resolved for the next session. But Mr. Craine will talk to you in a few minutes. A quick question for Graeme Corrin. Oh, and Mr. Corrin, right? Okay, super. Thank you. What we have here is about a dozen questions which we've not even reached. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask the department in the break now if these can be printed on the website or on the Facebook page. And some answers given, because I appreciate a number of you have asked questions, albeit anonymously, and are not getting them heard because we're out of time. And I think that's very important that there is an answer given. So I'm going to speak to somebody from the department afterwards. Did I see one more hand here just before we wrap it up? You're going to have to fight between you, I'm afraid. Maria.
If you look to Jersey, Guernsey, England, Northern Ireland, Wales, they all publish A star A as one score, A star to A, and then the percentage of level 3. On that day, phone the department and ask why we published A star to B and could I have that information. It's important information because you've got a child who's transitioning through to sixth form. You want to know Is chemistry good for school? Is history bad for school? How are we doing overall? Paul Craine is seriously a numbers man, and he talks about parents having informed choices, having the right information about the department, monitoring and evaluating. For a month and a half, almost a month and a half later, I've had no answers to those questions. The answer has been the department doesn't hold that information from the schools. And yet Max Curley tells us there's great communication technology between the schools and the department. I can't understand, is it that the department doesn't want to release the information? Is it that it doesn't hold the information? Or something separate? We should be able as parents to judge the department, to understand what's going on in our schools. How many kids left Aberdeen without any GCSEs? Why don't we know that data? We've had lots of words, we've had very little in terms of numbers.
Thank you, Maria. There's a couple of questions in there, but Paul, I think, has got the gist.
Yes, yeah, I'm happy with that. The results that come out in England on the results day or the day after results day are something completely different, because they're not coming from schools to some sort of central position handed out. They're coming from the exam boards. So they actually include the Isle of Man data. It's included in those. And that data that comes out from the exam boards doesn't just relate to students who were 18 at the, in the correct year for being in year 13, which is what the data does need to relate to eventually. The data for local authorities and for some of the academy change in the UK, maybe a couple of months yet before you get that where it's been aggregated down for the school. The schools here, I understand, have got to have their results on their websites by the 29th of this month. So that data's coming through. It's a little bit more complicated in the Isle of Man because we are using a range of different examinations. So some students may be sitting Scottish qualifications and some are sitting English qualifications. So it's a little bit more complicated to handle. And it also makes it more difficult to get percentages that are comparable with UK percentages, But the results do get there. The schools do know the data. There's no attempt to hide that. It's a useful, the data is a useful source. It's useful for the department, it's useful for the schools. When we talk about school self-improvement, that's at the heart of one of the things they're looking at to see how they can improve outcomes. So it's there in the system. When we talk about the validation of the school reviews and very experienced people coming from away to help with that, they will be going through that data very thoroughly. I've been an accredited Ofsted inspector and accredited school performance, school improvement officer, and that's exactly the sort of work that I would do with individual schools.
I think you've partly answered the question, and thank you for that. I appreciate you couldn't hear it all.